Judea. 1. The Promised Land. Palestine, climate, prehistory, Abraham's people, the Jews in Egypt, the Exodus, the conquest of Canaan. A Buckle or a Montesquieu, eager to interpret history through geography, might have taken a handsome leaf out of Palestine. 150 miles from Dan on the north to Beersheba on the south, 25 to 80 miles from the Philistines on the west to the Syrians, Arameans, Ammonites, Moabites, and Edomites on the east. One would not expect so tiny a territory to play a major role in history, or to leave behind it an influence greater than that of Babylonia, Assyria, or Persia, perhaps greater even than that of Egypt or Greece. But it was the fortune and misfortune of Palestine that it lay midway between the capitals of the Nile and those of the Tigris and Euphrates. This circumstance brought trade to Judea, and it brought war. Time and again the harassed Hebrews were compelled to take sides in the struggle of the empires, to pay tribute or be overrun. Behind the Bible, behind the plaintive cries of the psalmists and the prophets for help from the sky, lay this imperiled place of the Jews between the upper and nether millstones of Mesopotamia and Egypt. The climatic history of the land tells us again how precarious a thing civilization is, and how its great enemies, barbarism and desiccation, are always waiting to destroy it. Once Palestine was a land flowing with milk and honey, as many a passage in the Pentateuch describes it. Josephus, in the 1st century after Christ, still speaks of it as moist enough for agriculture and very beautiful. They have abundance of trees and are full of autumn fruits, both wild and cultivated. They are not naturally watered by many rivers, but derive their chief moisture from rain, of which they have no want. In ancient days, the spring rains that fed the land were stored in cisterns or brought back to the surface by a multitude of wells, and distributed over the country by a network of canals. This was the physical basis of Jewish civilization. The soil, so nourished, produced barley, wheat, and corn. The vine throve on it, and trees bore olives, figs, dates, or other fruits on every slope. When war came and devastated these artificially fertile fields, or when some conqueror exiled to distant regions the families that had cared for them, the desert crept in eagerly, and in a few years undid the work of generations. We cannot judge the fruitfulness of ancient Palestine from the barren wastes and timid oases that confronted the brave Jews who in our own time returned to their old home after 18 centuries of exile, dispersion, and suffering. History is older in Palestine than Bishop Ussher supposed. Neanderthal remains have been unearthed near the Sea of Galilee, and 5 Neanderthal skeletons were recently discovered in a cave near Haifa. It appears likely that the Mousterian culture, which flourished in Europe about 40,000 B.C., extended to Palestine. At Jericho, Neolithic floors and hearths have been exhumed that carry back the history of the region down to a Middle Bronze Age, 2000 to 1600 B.C., in which the towns of Palestine and Syria had accumulated such wealth as to invite conquest by Egypt. In the 15th century before Christ, Jericho was a well-walled city, ruled by kings acknowledging the suzerainty of Egypt. The tombs of these kings, excavated by the Garstang expedition, contained hundreds of vases, funerary offerings, and other objects, indicating a settled life at Jericho in the time of the Hyksos domination, and a fairly developed civilization in the days of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. It becomes apparent that the different dates at which we begin the history of diverse peoples are merely the marks of our ignorance. The Tel El Amarna letters carry on the general picture of Palestinian and Syrian life almost to the entrance of the Jews into the valley of the Nile. It is probable, though not certain, that the Habiru spoken of in this correspondence were the Hebrews. The Jews believed that the people of Abraham had come from Ur in Sumeria, and had settled in Palestine, circa 22,000 B.C., 1,000 years or more before Moses, and that the conquest of the Canaanites was merely a capture by the Hebrews of the land promised them by their God. The Amraphel mentioned in Genesis, chapter 14, verse 1, as king of Shinar in those days, was probably Amarpal, father of Hammurabi and his predecessor on the throne of Babylon. There are no direct references in contemporary sources to either the Exodus or the conquest of Canaan, and the only indirect reference is the stele erected by Pharaoh Merneptah, circa 1225 B.C., part of which reads as follows: "The kings are overthrown, saying Salam. Wasted is Tehenu. The Hittite land is pacified, plundered is Canaan, with every evil. Israel is desolated, her seed is not. Palestine has become a widow for Egypt. All lands are united, they are pacified. Every one that is turbulent is bound by King Merneptah. This does not prove that Merneptah was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. It proves little except that Egyptian armies had again ravaged Palestine. We cannot tell when the Jews entered Egypt, nor whether they came to it as freemen or as slaves. Perhaps they followed in the track of the Hyksos, whose Semitic rule in Egypt might have offered them some protection. Petrie, accepting the Bible figure of 430 years for the stay of the Jews in Egypt, dates their arrival about 1650 B.C., their exit about 1220 B.C. We may take it as likely that the immigrants were at first a modest number, and that the many thousands of Jews in Egypt in Moses' time were the consequence of a high birth rate. As in all periods, the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. The story of the bondage in Egypt, of the use of the Jews as slaves in great construction enterprises, their rebellion and escape, or emigration to Asia, has many internal signs of essential truth, mingled, of course, with supernatural interpolations customary in all the historical writing of the ancient East. Even the story of Moses must not be rejected offhand. It is astonishing, however, that no mention is made of him by either Amos or Isaiah, whose preaching appears to have preceded by a century the composition of the Pentateuch. Manetho, an Egyptian historian of the 3rd century B.C., as reported by Josephus, tells us that the Exodus was due to the desire of the Egyptians to protect themselves from a plague that had broken out among the destitute and enslaved Jews, and that Moses was an Egyptian priest who went as a missionary among the Jewish lepers and gave them laws of cleanliness modeled upon those of the Egyptian clergy. Greek and Roman writers repeat this explanation of the Exodus, but their anti-Semitic inclinations make them unreliable guides. One verse of the biblical account supports Ward's interpretation of the Exodus as a labor strike. And the king of Egypt said unto them, Wherefore do ye, Moses and Aaron, let the people from their works? Get you unto your burdens. Moses is an Egyptian rather than a Jewish name. Perhaps it is a shorter form of Amos. Professor Garstang of the Marston expedition of the University of Liverpool claims to have discovered in the royal tombs of Jericho evidence that Moses was rescued, precisely in 1527 B.C., by the then princess, later the great queen Hatshepsut, that he was brought up by her as a court favorite and fled from Egypt upon the accession of her enemy Thutmose III. He believes that the material found in these tombs confirms the story of the fall of Jericho, Joshua chapter 6. He dates this fall circa 1400 B.C. and the Exodus circa 1447 B.C. As this chronology rests upon the precarious dating of scarabs and pottery, it must be received with respectful skepticism. When Moses led the Jews to Mount Sinai, he was merely following the route laid down by Egyptian turquoise hunting expeditions for 1,000 years before him. The account of the 40 years wandering in the desert, once looked upon as incredible, now seems reasonable enough in a traditionally nomadic people, and the conquest of Canaan was but one more instance of a hungry nomad horde falling upon a settled community. The conquerors killed as many as they could and married the rest. Slaughter was unconfined and, to follow the text, was divinely ordained and enjoyed. Gideon, in capturing 2 cities, slew 120,000 men. Only in the annals of the Assyrians do we meet again with such hearty killing or easy counting. Occasionally, we are told, the land rested from war. Moses had been a patient statesman, but Joshua was only a plain, blunt warrior. Moses had ruled bloodlessly by inventing interviews with God, but Joshua ruled by the second law of nature, that the superior killer survives. In this realistic and unsentimental fashion, the Jews took their promised land. 2. Solomon in all his glory. Race, appearance, language, organization, judges and kings, Saul, David, Solomon, his wealth, the temple, rise of the social problem in Israel. Of their racial origin we can only say vaguely that they were Semites, not sharply distinct or different from the other Semites of Western Asia. It was their history that made them, not they who made their history. At their very first appearance they are already a mixture of many stocks. Only by the most unbelievable virtue could a pure race have existed among the 1,000 ethnic cross-currents of the Near East. But the Jews were the purest of all, for they intermarried only very reluctantly with other peoples. Hence they have maintained their type with astonishing tenacity. The Hebrew prisoners on the Egyptian and Assyrian reliefs, despite the prejudices of the artist, are recognizably like the Jews of our own time. There, too, are the long and curved Hittite nose, the projecting cheekbones, the curly hair and beard, though one cannot see under the Egyptian caricature the scrawny toughness of the body, the subtlety and obstinacy of spirit, that have characterized the Semites from the stiff-necked followers of Moses to the inscrutable Bedouins and tradesmen of today. In the early years of their conquest, they dressed in simple tunics, low-crowned hats or turban-like caps, and easy-going sandals. As wealth came, they covered their feet with leather shoes and their tunics with fringed caftans. Their women, who were among the most beautiful of antiquity, painted their cheeks and their eyes, wore all the jewelry they could get, and adopted to the best of their ability the newest styles from Babylon, Nineveh, Damascus, or Tyre. Hebrew was among the most majestically sonorous of all the languages of the earth. Despite its gutturals, it was full of masculine music. Renan described it as a quiver full of arrows, a trumpet of brasses crashing through the air. It did not differ much from the speech of the Phoenicians or the Moabites. The Jews used an alphabet akin to the Phoenician. Some scholars believe it to be the oldest alphabet known. They did not bother to write vowels, leaving these for the sense to fill in. Even today the Hebrew vowels are mere points adorning the consonants. The invaders never formed a united nation, but remained for a long time as 12 more or less independent tribes, organized and ruled on the principles not of the state but of the patriarchal family. The oldest head of each family group participated in a council of elders, which was the last court of law and justice in the tribe, and which cooperated with the leaders of other tribes only under the compulsion of dire emergency. The family was the most convenient economic unit in tilling the fields and tending the flocks. This was the source of its strength, its authority, and its political power. A measure of family communism softened the rigors of paternal discipline and created memories to which the prophets harked back disconsolately in more individualistic days. For when, under Solomon, industry came to the towns and made the individual the new economic unit of production, the authority of the family weakened, even as today, and the inherent order of Jewish life decayed. The judges, to whom the tribes occasionally gave a united obedience, were not magistrates, but chieftains or warriors, even when they were priests. In those days there was no king in Israel, but every man did that which was right in his own eyes. This incredibly Jeffersonian condition gave way under the needs of war. The threat of domination by the Philistines brought a temporary unity to the tribes and persuaded them to appoint a king whose authority over them should be continuous. The prophet Samuel warned them against certain disadvantages in rule by one man. And Samuel said, "This will be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for himself, for his chariots, and to be his horsemen. And some shall run before his chariots. And he will appoint them captains over thousands, and captains over 50s, and will set them to ear his ground, and to reap his harvest, and to make his instruments of war and instruments of his chariots. And he will take your daughters to be confectionaries, to be cooks, and to be bakers. And he will take your fields and your vineyards and your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. And he will take your men servants and your maid servants, and your goodliest young men and your asses, and put them to his work. He will take the 10th of your sheep, and ye shall be his servants. And ye shall cry out in that day because of your king, which ye shall have chosen you, and the Lord will not hear you in that day." Nevertheless the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, "Nay, but we shall have a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us, and go out before us and fight our battles." Their first king, Saul, gave them good and evil instructively, fought their battles bravely, lived simply on his own estate at Gilead, pursued young David with murderous attentions, and was beheaded in flight from the Philistines. The Jews learned then, at the first opportunity, that wars of succession are among the appanages of monarchy. Unless the little epic of Saul, Jonathan, and David is merely a masterpiece of literary creation, for there is no contemporary mention of these personalities outside the Bible, this first king, after a bloody interlude, was succeeded by David, heroic slayer of Goliath, tender lover of Jonathan and many maidens, half-naked dancer of wild dances, seductive player of the harp, sweet singer of marvelous songs, and able king of the Jews for almost 40 years. Here, so early in literature, is a character fully drawn, real, with all the contradictory passions of a living soul, as ruthless as his time, his tribe, and his God, and yet as ready to pardon his enemies as Caesar was, or Christ, putting captives to death wholesale like any Assyrian monarch, charging his son Solomon to bring down to the grave with blood the hoar head of old Shimei, who had cursed him many years before, taking Uriah's wife into his harem incontinently, and sending Uriah into the front line of battle to get rid of him, accepting Nathan's rebuke humbly, but keeping the lovely Bathsheba nonetheless, forgiving Saul almost 70 times 7, merely taking his shield when he might have taken his life, sparing and supporting Mephibosheth, a possible pretender to his throne, pardoning his ungrateful son Absalom, who had been caught in armed rebellion, and bitterly mourning that son's death in treasonable battle against his father. "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom! Would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son!" This is an authentic man, of full and varied elements, bearing within him all the vestiges of barbarism and all the promise of civilization. On coming to the throne, Solomon, for his peace of mind, slew all rival claimants. This did not disturb Yahweh, who, taking a liking to the young king, promised him wisdom beyond all men before or after him. Perhaps Solomon deserves his reputation, for not only did he combine in his own life the Epicurean enjoyment of every pleasure and luxury with the stoic fulfillment of all his obligations as a king, but he taught his people the values of law and order, and lured them from discord and war to industry and peace. He lived up to his name, for during his long reign Jerusalem, which David had made the capital, took advantage of this unwonted quiet and increased and multiplied its wealth. Originally, the city had been built around a well. Then it had been turned into a fortress because of its exalted position above the plain. Now, though it was not on the main lines of trade, it became one of the busiest markets of the Near East. By maintaining the good relations that David had established with King Hiram of Tyre, Solomon encouraged Phoenician merchants to direct their caravans through Palestine and developed a profitable exchange of agricultural products from Israel for the manufactured articles of Tyre and Sidon. He built a fleet of mercantile vessels on the Red Sea and persuaded Hiram to use this new route instead of Egypt in trading with Arabia and Africa. It was probably in Arabia that Solomon mined the gold and precious stones of Ophir, probably from Arabia that the Queen of Sheba came to seek his friendship, and perhaps his aid. We are told that the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold. And though this could not compare with the revenues of Babylon, Nineveh, or Tyre, it lifted Solomon to a place among the richest potentates of his time. Some of this wealth he used for his private pleasure. He indulged particularly his hobby for collecting concubines, though historians undramatically reduce his 700 wives and 300 concubines to 60 and 80. Perhaps by some of these marriages he wished to strengthen his friendship with Egypt and Phoenicia. Perhaps, like Ramesses II, he was animated with the eugenic passion for transmitting his superior abilities. But most of his revenues went to the strengthening of his government and the beautification of his capital. He repaired the citadel around which the city had been built. He raised forts and stationed garrisons at strategic points of his realm to discourage both invasion and revolt. He divided his kingdom for administrative purposes into 12 districts which deliberately crossed the tribal boundaries. By this plan he hoped to lessen the clannish separatism of the tribes and to weld them into one people. He failed, and Judea failed with him. To finance his government he organized expeditions to mine precious metals and to import luxuries and strange delicacies. For example, ivory, apes, and peacocks, which could be sold to the growing bourgeoisie at high prices. He levied tolls upon all caravans passing through Palestine. He put a poll tax upon all his subject peoples, requiring contributions from every district except his own, and reserved to the state a monopoly of the trade in yarn, horses, and chariots. Josephus assures us that Solomon made silver as plentiful in Jerusalem as stones in the street. Finally, he resolved to adorn the city with a new temple for Yahweh and a new palace for himself. We gather some sense of the turbulence of Jewish life from the fact that before this time there had been apparently no temple at all in Judea, not even in Jerusalem. The people had sacrificed to Yahweh in local sanctuaries or on crude altars in the hills. Solomon called the more substantial burghers together, announced his plans for a temple, pledged to it great quantities of gold, silver, brass, iron, wood, and precious stones from his own stores, and gently suggested that the temple would welcome contributions from the citizens. If we may believe the chronicler, they pledged for his use 5,000 gold talents, 10,000 silver talents, and as much iron and brass as he might need. And they with whom precious stones were found gave them to the treasure of the house of the Lord. The site chosen was on a hill. The walls of the temple rose, like the Parthenon, continuously from the rocky slopes. The design was in the style that the Phoenicians had adopted from Egypt, with decorative ideas from Assyria and Babylon. The temple was not a church, but a quadrangular enclosure composed of several buildings. The main structure was of modest dimensions, about 124 feet in length, 55 in breadth, and 52 in height, half the length of the Parthenon, a quarter of the length of Chartres. The Hebrews, who came from all Judea to contribute to the temple, and later to worship in it, forgivably looked upon it as one of the wonders of the world. They had not seen the immensely greater temples of Thebes, Babylon, and Nineveh. Before the main structure rose a porch, some 180 feet high, overlaid with gold. Gold was spread lavishly about, if we may credit our sole authority, on the beams of the main ceiling, on the posts, the doors, and the walls, on the candelabra, the lamps, the snuffers, the spoons, the censers, and 100 basins of gold. Precious stones were inlaid here and there, and 2 gold-plated cherubim guarded the Ark of the Covenant. The walls were of great square stones. The ceiling, posts, and doors were of carved cedar and olive wood. Most of the building materials were brought from Phoenicia, and most of the skilled work was done by artisans imported from Sidon and Tyre. The unskilled labor was herded together by a ruthless corvée of 150,000 men after the fashion of the time. So for 7 years the temple rose to provide for 4 centuries a lordly home for Yahweh. Then for 13 years more the artisans and people labored to build a much larger edifice for Solomon and his harem. Merely one wing of it, the house of the forest of Lebanon, was 4 times as large as the temple. The walls of the main building were made of immense stone blocks 15 feet in length and were ornamented with statuary, reliefs, and paintings in the Assyrian style. The palace contained halls for the royal reception of distinguished visitors, apartments for the king, separate quarters for the more important wives, and an arsenal as the final basis of government. Not a stone of the gigantic edifice survives, and its site is unknown. Having established his kingdom, Solomon settled down to enjoy it. As his reign proceeded, he paid less and less attention to religion and frequented his harem rather more than the temple. The biblical chroniclers reproach him bitterly for his gallantry in building altars to the exotic deities of his foreign wives, and cannot forgive his philosophical, or perhaps political, impartiality to the gods. The people admired his wisdom, but suspected in it a certain centripetal quality. The temple and the palace had cost them much gold and blood, and were not more popular with them than the pyramids had been with the workingmen of Egypt. The upkeep of these establishments required considerable taxation, and few governments have made taxation popular. When he died, Israel was exhausted, and a discontented proletariat had been created whose labor found no steady employment, and whose sufferings were to transform the warlike cult of Yahweh into the almost socialistic religion of the prophets. 3. The God of Hosts. Polytheism, Yahweh, henotheism, character of the Hebrew religion, the idea of sin, sacrifice, circumcision, the priesthood, strange gods. Next to the promulgation of the Book of Law, the building of the temple was the most important event in the epic of the Jews. It not only gave Yahweh a home, but it gave Judea a spiritual center and capital, a vehicle of tradition, a memory to serve as a pillar of fire through centuries of wandering over the earth. And it played its part in lifting the Hebrew religion from a primitive polytheism to a faith intense and intolerant, but nonetheless one of the creative creeds of history. As they first entered the historic scene, the Jews were nomad Bedouins who feared the jinns of the air and worshipped rocks, cattle, sheep, and the spirits of caves and hills. The cult of the bull, the sheep, and the lamb was not neglected. Moses could never quite win his flock from adoration of the golden calf, for the Egyptian worship of the bull was still fresh in their memories, and Yahweh was for a long time symbolized in that ferocious vegetarian. In Exodus, chapter 32, verses 25 to 28, we read how the Jews indulged in a naked dance before the golden calf, and how Moses and the Levites, or priestly class, slew 3,000 of them in punishment of their idolatry. Of serpent worship there are countless traces in early Jewish history, from the serpent images found in the oldest ruins to the brazen serpent made by Moses and worshipped in the temple until the time of Hezekiah, circa 720 B.C. As among so many peoples, the snake seemed sacred to the Jews, partly as a phallic symbol of virility, partly as typifying wisdom, subtlety, and eternity, literally because of its ability to make both ends meet. Baal, symbolized in conical upright stones much like the linga of the Hindus, was venerated by some of the Hebrews as the male principle of reproduction, the husband of the land that he fertilized. Just as primitive polytheism survived in the worship of angels and saints, and in the teraphim or portable idols that serve as household gods, so the magical notions rife in the early cults persisted to a late day despite the protests of prophets and priests. The people seem to have looked upon Moses and Aaron as magicians, and to have patronized professional diviners and sorcerers. Divination was sought at times by shaking dice, Urim and Thummim, out of a box, ephod, a ritual still used to ascertain the will of the gods. It is to the credit of the priests that they opposed these practices and preached an exclusive reliance on the magic of sacrifice, prayer, and contributions. Slowly the conception of Yahweh as the one national God took form and gave to Jewish faith a unity and simplicity lifted up above the chaotic multiplicity of the Mesopotamian pantheons. Apparently the conquering Jews took one of the gods of Canaan, Yahu, and recreated him in their own image as a stern, warlike, stiff-necked deity with almost lovable limitations. For this god makes no claim to omniscience. He asks the Jews to identify their homes by sprinkling them with the blood of the sacrificial lamb, lest he should destroy their children inadvertently along with the firstborn of the Egyptians. He is not above making mistakes, of which man is his worst. He regrets too late that he created Adam or allowed Saul to become king. He is now and then greedy, irascible, bloodthirsty, capricious, petulant. I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and will show mercy to whom I will show mercy. He approves Jacob's use of deceit in revenging himself upon Laban. His conscience is as flexible as that of a bishop in politics. He is talkative and likes to make long speeches, but he is shy and will not allow men to see anything of him but his hind parts. Never was there so thoroughly human a god. Originally he seems to have been a god of thunder, dwelling in the hills and worshipped for the same reason that the youthful Gorky was a believer when it thundered. The authors of the Pentateuch, to whom religion was an instrument of statesmanship, formed this Vulcan into Mars, so that in their energetic hands Yahweh became predominantly an imperialistic expansionist god of hosts, who fights for his people as fiercely as the gods of the Iliad. The Lord is a man of war, says Moses, and David echoes him. He teacheth my hands to war. Yahweh promises to destroy all the people to whom the Jews shall come, and to drive out the Hivite, the Canaanite, and the Hittite by little and little. And he claims as his own all the territory conquered by the Jews. He will have no pacifist nonsense. He knows that even a promised land can be won and held only by the sword. He is a god of war because he has to be. It will take centuries of military defeat, political subjugation, and moral development to transform him into the gentle and loving father of Hillel and Christ. He is as vain as a soldier. He drinks up praise with a bottomless appetite, and he is anxious to display his prowess by drowning the Egyptians. They shall know that I am the Lord when I have gotten me honor upon Pharaoh. To gain successes for his people he commits or commands brutalities as repugnant to our taste as they were acceptable to the morals of the age. He slaughters whole nations with the naive pleasure of a Gulliver fighting for Lilliput. Because the Jews commit whoredom with the daughters of Moab, he bids Moses take all the heads of the people and hang them up before the Lord against the sun. It is the morality of Ashurbanipal and Ashur. He offers to show mercy to those who love him and keep his commandments, but, like some resolute germ, he will punish children for the sins of their fathers, their grandfathers, even their great-great-grandfathers. He is so ferocious that he thinks of destroying all the Jews for worshipping the golden calf, and Moses has to argue with him that he should control himself. Turn from thy fierce wrath, the man tells his God, and repent of this evil against thy people. And the Lord repented of the evil which he thought to do unto his people. Again, Yahweh proposes to exterminate the Jews root and branch for rebelling against Moses, but Moses appeals to his better nature and bids him think what people will say when they hear of such a thing. He asks a cruel test, human sacrifice of the bitterest sort, from Abraham. Like Moses, Abraham teaches Yahweh the principles of morals and persuades him not to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah if there shall be found 50, 40, 30, 20, 10 good men in those cities. Bit by bit he lures his God towards decency and illustrates the manner in which the moral development of man compels the periodical recreation of his deities. The curses with which Yahweh threatens his chosen people if they disobey him are models of vituperation, and inspired those who burned heretics in the Inquisition or excommunicated Spinoza. Cursed shalt thou be in the city, and cursed shalt thou be in the field. Cursed shall be the fruit of thy body, and the fruit of thy land. Cursed shalt thou be when thou comest in, and cursed shalt thou be when thou goest out. The Lord shall smite thee with a consumption, and with a fever, and with an inflammation. The Lord will smite thee with the botch of Egypt, and with the emerods, tumors, and with the scab, and with the itch, whereof thou canst not be healed. The Lord shall smite thee with madness and blindness and astonishment of heart. Also every sickness and every plague which is not written in the book of this law, them will the Lord bring upon thee until thou be destroyed. Yahweh was not the only God whose existence was recognized by the Jews or by himself. All that he asked in the first commandment was that he should be placed above the rest. I am a jealous God, he confesses, and he bids his followers utterly overthrow his rivals and quite break down their images. The Jews before Isaiah seldom thought of Yahweh as the God of all tribes, even of all Hebrews. The Moabites had their god Chemosh, to whom Naomi thought it right that Ruth should remain loyal. Beelzebub was the god of Ekron. Milcom was the god of Ammon. The economic and political separatism of these peoples naturally resulted in what we might call their theological independence. Moses sings in his famous song, "Who is like unto thee, O Lord, among the gods?" And Solomon says, "Great is our God above all gods." Not only was Tammuz accepted as a real god by all but the most educated Jews, but his cult was at one time so popular in Judea that Ezekiel complained that the ritual wailing for Tammuz's death could be heard in the temple. So distinct and autonomous were the Jewish tribes that even in the time of Jeremiah many of them had their own deities. "According to the number of thy cities are thy gods, O Judah." And the gloomy prophet goes on to protest against the worship of Baal and Moloch by his people. With the growth of political unity under David and Solomon, and the centering of worship in the temple at Jerusalem, theology reflected history and politics, and Yahweh became the sole God of the Jews. Beyond this henotheism, they made no further progress towards monotheism until the prophets. Henotheism is a clumsy but useful word coined by Max Müller to designate the worship of a god as supreme, combined with the explicit, as in India, or tacit, as in Judea, admission of other gods. Even in the Yahvistic stage, the Hebraic religion came closer to monotheism than any other pre-prophetic faith, except the ephemeral sun worship of Ikhnaton. At least equal as sentiment and poetry to the polytheism of Babylonia and Greece, Judaism was immensely superior to the other religions of the time in majesty and power, in philosophic unity and grasp, in moral fervor and influence. This intense and somber religion never took on any of the ornate ritual and joyous ceremonies that marked the worship of the Egyptian and Babylonian gods. A sense of human nothingness before an arbitrary deity darkened all ancient Jewish thought. Despite the efforts of Solomon to beautify the cult of Yahweh with color and sound, the worship of this awful divinity remained for many centuries a religion of fear rather than of love. One wonders, in looking back upon these faiths, whether they brought as much consolation as terror to humanity. Religions of hope and love are a luxury of security and order. The need for striking fear into a subject or rebellious people made most primitive religions cults of mystery and dread. The Ark of the Covenant, containing the sacred scrolls of the law, symbolized by its untouchability the character of the Jewish creed. When the pious Uzzah, to prevent the ark from falling into the dust, caught it for a moment in his hands, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God smote him there for his error, and there he died. The central idea in Judaic theology was that of sin. Never has another people been so fond of virtue, unless it was those Puritans who seemed to step out of the Old Testament with no interruption of Catholic centuries. Since the flesh was weak and the law complex, sin was inevitable, and the Jewish spirit was often overcast with the thought of sin's consequences, from the withholding of rain to the ruin of all Israel. There was no hell in this faith as a distinctive place of punishment, but almost as bad was the Sheol, or land of darkness under the earth, which received all the dead, good and wicked alike, except such divine favorites as Moses, Enoch, and Elijah. The Jews, however, made little reference to a life beyond the grave. Their creed said nothing of personal immortality, and confined its rewards and punishments to this mundane life. Not until the Jews had lost hope of earthly triumph did they take over, probably from Persia and perhaps also from Egypt, the notion of personal resurrection. It was out of this spiritual denouement that Christianity was born. The threat and consequence of sin might be offset by prayer or sacrifice. Semitic, like Aryan sacrifice, began by offering human victims. Then it offered animals, the first fruits of the flocks, and food from the fields. Finally, it compromised by offering praise. At first, no animal might be eaten unless killed and blessed by the priest and offered for a moment to the god. Circumcision partook of the nature of a sacrifice and perhaps of a commutation. The god took a part for the whole. Menstruation and childbirth, like sin, made a person spiritually unclean, and necessitated ritual purification by priestly sacrifice and prayer. At every turn, taboos hedged in the faithful. Sin lay potential in almost every desire, and donations were required in atonement for almost every sin. Only the priests could offer sacrifice properly or explain correctly the ritual and mysteries of the faith. The priests were a closed caste, to which none but the descendants of Levi could belong. They could not inherit property, but they were exempt from all taxation, toll, or tribute. They levied a tithe upon the harvests of the flocks, and turned to their own use such offerings to the temple as were left unused by the god. After the exile, the wealth of the clergy grew with that of the renascent community. And since this sacerdotal wealth was well administered, augmented, and preserved, it finally made the priests of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, as in Thebes and Babylon, more powerful than the king. Nevertheless, the growth of clerical power and religious education never quite sufficed to win the Hebrews from superstition and idolatry. The hilltops and groves continued to harbor alien gods and to witness secret rites. A substantial minority of the people prostrated themselves before sacred stones, or worshipped Baal or Astarte, or practiced divination in the Babylonian manner, or set up images and burned incense to them, or knelt before the brazen serpent or the golden calf, or filled the temple with the noise of heathen feasting, or made their children pass through the fire in sacrifice. Even some of the kings, like Solomon and Ahab, went a-whoring after foreign gods. Holy men like Elijah and Elisha arose who, without necessarily becoming priests, preached against these practices and tried by the example of their lives to lead their people into righteousness. Out of these conditions and beginnings, and out of the rise of poverty and exploitation in Israel, came the supreme figures in Jewish religion, those passionate prophets who purified and elevated the creed of the Jews and prepared it for its vicarious conquest of the Western world. 4. The First Radicals. The Class War, Origin of the Prophets, Amos at Jerusalem, Isaiah, his attacks upon the rich, his doctrine of a Messiah, the influence of the prophets. Since poverty is created by wealth and never knows itself poor until riches stare it in the face, so it required the fabulous fortune of Solomon to mark the beginning of the class war in Israel. Solomon, like Peter and Lenin, tried to move too quickly from an agricultural to an industrial state. Not only did the toil and taxes involved in his enterprises impose great burdens upon his people, but when those undertakings were complete, after 20 years of industry, a proletariat had been created in Jerusalem which, lacking sufficient employment, became a source of political faction and corruption in Palestine, precisely as it was to become in Rome. Slums developed step by step with the rise of private wealth and the increasing luxury of the court. Exploitation and usury became recognized practices among the owners of great estates and the merchants and moneylenders who flocked about the temple. The landlords of Ephraim, said Amos, sold the righteous for silver and the poor for a pair of shoes. This growing gap between the needy and the affluent, and the sharpening of that conflict between the city and the country which always accompanies an industrial civilization, had something to do with the division of Palestine into two hostile kingdoms after the death of Solomon. A northern kingdom of Ephraim, with its capital at Samaria, and a southern kingdom of Judah, with its capital at Jerusalem. From that time on, the Jews were weakened by fraternal hatred and strife, breaking out occasionally into bitter war. Shortly after the death of Solomon, Jerusalem was captured by Sheshank, Pharaoh of Egypt, and surrendered to appease the conqueror nearly all the gold that Solomon had gathered in his long career of taxation. It was in this atmosphere of political disruption, economic war, and religious degeneration that the prophets appeared. The men to whom the word, in Hebrew Nabi, was first applied were not quite of the character that our reverence would associate with Amos and Isaiah. Some were diviners who could read the secrets of the heart and the past and foretell the future according to remuneration. Some were fanatics who worked themselves into a frenzy by weird music, strong drink, or dervish-like dances, and spoke, in trances, words which their hearers considered inspired, that is, breathed into them by some spirit other than their own. Jeremiah speaks with professional scorn of every man that is mad and maketh himself a prophet. Some were gloomy recluses, like Elijah. Many of them lived in schools or monasteries near the temples, but most of them had private property and wives. From this motley crowd of fakirs, the prophets developed into responsible and consistent critics of their age and their people, magnificent street-corner statesmen who were all thoroughgoing anti-clericals and the most uncompromising of anti-Semites, a cross between soothsayers and socialists. We misunderstand them if we take them as prophets in the weather sense. Their predictions were hopes or threats or pious interpolations, or prognostications after the event. The prophets themselves did not pretend to foretell so much as to speak out. They were eloquent members of the opposition. In one phase they were Tolstoyans, incensed at industrial exploitation and ecclesiastical chicanery. They came up from the simple countryside and hurled damnation at the corrupt wealth of the towns. Amos described himself not as a prophet, but as a simple village shepherd. Having left his herds to see Bethel, he was horrified at the unnatural complexity of the life which he discovered there, the inequality of fortune, the bitterness of competition, the ruthlessness of exploitation. So he stood in the gate and lashed the conscienceless rich and their luxuries. Forasmuch therefore as your treading is upon the poor, and ye take from him burdens of wheat, ye have built houses of hewn stone, but ye shall not dwell in them. Ye have planted pleasant vineyards, but ye shall not drink wine of them. Woe to them that are at ease in Zion, that lie upon beds of ivory, and stretch themselves upon their couches, and eat the lambs out of the flock, and the calves out of the midst of the stall. That chant to the sound of the viol, and invent to themselves instruments of music, like David. That drink wine in bowls, and anoint themselves with the chief ointments. I despise your feast days, saith the Lord. Though ye offer me burnt offerings and your meat offerings, I will not accept them. Take thou away from me the noise of thy songs, for I will not hear the melody of thy viols. But let judgment run down as waters, and righteousness as a mighty stream. This is a new note in the world's literature. It is true that Amos dulls the edge of his idealism by putting into the mouth of his God a Mississippi of threats, whose severity and accumulation make the reader sympathize for a moment with the drinkers of wine and the listeners to music. But here, for the first time in the literature of Asia, the social conscience takes definite form, and pours into religion a content that lifts it from ceremony and flattery to a whip of morals and a call to nobility. With Amos begins the gospel of Jesus Christ. One of his bitterest predictions seems to have been fulfilled while Amos was still alive. Thus saith the Lord, as the shepherd taketh out of the mouth of the lion 2 legs or a piece of an ear, so shall the children of Israel be taken out that dwell in Samaria in the corner of a bed, and in Damascus in a couch. And the houses of ivory shall perish, and the great houses shall have an end. The reference is apparently to the room made entirely of ivory in the palace at Samaria where King Ahab lived with his painted queen Jezebel, circa 875 to 850 B.C. Several fine ivories have been found by the Harvard Library expedition in the ruins of a palace tentatively identified with Ahab's. About the same time, another prophet threatened Samaria with destruction in one of those myriads of vivid phrases which King James's translators minted for the currency of our speech out of the wealth of the Bible. The calf of Samaria, said Hosea, shall be broken into pieces, for they have sown the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind. In 733, the young king of Judah, threatened by Ephraim in alliance with Syria, appealed to Assyria for help. Assyria came, took Damascus, subjected Syria, Tyre, and Palestine to tribute, made note of Jewish efforts to secure Egyptian aid, invaded again, captured Samaria, indulged in unprintable diplomatic exchanges with the king of Judah, failed to take Jerusalem, and retired to Nineveh laden with booty and 200,000 Jewish captives doomed to Assyrian slavery. It was during this siege of Jerusalem that the prophet Isaiah became one of the great figures of Hebrew history. The book that bears his name is a collection of prophecies, that is, sermons, by 2 or more authors ranging in time from 710 to 300 B.C. Chapters 1 through 39 are usually ascribed to the first Isaiah, who is here discussed. Less provincial than Amos, he thought in terms of enduring statesmanship. Convinced that little Judah could not resist the imperial power of Assyria, even with the help of distant Egypt, that broken staff which would pierce the hand that should try to use it, he pled with King Ahaz, and then with King Hezekiah, to remain neutral in the war between Assyria and Ephraim. Like Amos and Hosea, he foresaw the fall of Samaria and the end of the northern kingdom. When, however, the Assyrians besieged Jerusalem, Isaiah counseled Hezekiah not to yield. The sudden withdrawal of Sennacherib's hosts seemed to justify him, and for a time his repute was high with the king and the people. Always his advice was to deal justly, and then leave the issue to Yahweh, who would use Assyria as his agent for a time, but in the end would destroy her too. Indeed, all the nations known to Isaiah were, according to him, destined to be struck down by Yahweh. In a few chapters, 16 through 23, Moab, Syria, Ethiopia, Egypt, Babylon, and Tyre are dedicated to destruction. Every one shall howl. This ardor for ruination, this litany of curses, mars Isaiah's book as it mars all the prophetic literature of the Bible. Nevertheless, his denunciation falls where it belongs, upon economic exploitation and greed. Here his eloquence rises to the highest point reached in the Old Testament, in passages that are among the peaks of the world's prose. The Lord will enter into judgment with the ancients of his people and the princes thereof, for ye have eaten up the vineyard, the spoil of the poor is in your houses. What mean ye, that ye beat my people to pieces and grind the faces of the poor? Woe unto them that join house to house, that lay field to field, till there be no place, that they may be placed alone in the midst of the earth. Woe unto them that decree unrighteous decrees, to turn aside the needy from judgment, justice, and to take away the right from the poor of my people, that widows may be their prey, and that they may rob the fatherless. And what will ye do in the day of visitation, and in the desolation which shall come from afar? To whom will ye flee for help, and where will ye leave your glory? He is filled with scorn of those who, while fleecing the poor, present a pious face to the world. To what purpose is the multitude of your sacrifices unto me, saith the Lord? I am full of the burnt offerings of rams, and the fat of fed beasts. Your appointed feasts my soul hateth. They are a trouble unto me. I am weary to hear them. And when ye spread forth your hands, I will hide mine eyes from you. Yea, when ye make many prayers, I will not hear. Your hands are full of blood. Wash ye, make ye clean, put away the evil of your doings from before mine eyes. Cease to do evil, learn to do well, seek judgment, justice. Relieve the oppressed, judge the fatherless, plead for the widow. He is bitter, but he does not despair of his people, just as Amos had ended his prophecies with a prediction, strangely apt today, of the restoration of the Jews to their native land. So Isaiah concludes by formulating the messianic hope, the trust of the Jews in some Redeemer who will end their political divisions, their subjection, and their misery, and bring an era of universal brotherhood and peace. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. For unto us a child is born, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. And there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord. With righteousness shall he judge the poor, and reprove with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips shall he slay the wicked. And righteousness shall be the girdle of his loins, and faithfulness the girdle of his reins. The wolf also shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. It was an admirable aspiration, but not for many generations yet would it express the mood of the Jews. The priests of the temple listened with a well-controlled sympathy to these useful encouragements to piety. Certain sects looked back to the prophets for part of their inspiration, and perhaps these excoriations of all sensual delight had some share in intensifying the desert-born Puritanism of the Jews. But for the most part the old life of the palace and the tent, the marketplace and the field, went on as before. War took its choice of every generation, and slavery continued to be the lot of the alien. The merchant cheated with his scales, and tried to atone with sacrifice and prayer. It was upon the Judaism of post-exilic days, and upon the world through Judaism and Christianity, that the prophets left their deepest mark. In Amos and Isaiah is the beginning of both Christianity and socialism, the spring from which has flowed a stream of utopias, wherein no poverty or war shall disturb human brotherhood and peace. They are the source of the early Jewish conception of a Messiah who would seize the government, re-establish the temporal power of the Jews, and inaugurate a dictatorship of the dispossessed among mankind. Isaiah and Amos began in a military age the exaltation of those virtues of simplicity and gentleness, of cooperation and friendliness, which Jesus was to make a vital element in his creed. They were the first to undertake the heavy task of reforming the God of hosts into a God of love. They conscripted Yahweh for humanitarianism as the radicals of the 19th century conscripted Christ for socialism. It was they who, when the Bible was printed in Europe, fired the Germanic mind with a rejuvenated Christianity and lighted the torch of the Reformation. It was their fierce and intolerant virtue that formed the Puritans. Their moral philosophy was based upon a theory that would bear better documentation, that the righteous man will prosper and the wicked will be struck down. But even if that should be a delusion, it is the failing of a noble mind. The prophets had no conception of freedom, but they loved justice and called for an end to the tribal limitations of morality. They offered to the unfortunate of the earth a vision of brotherhood that became the precious and unforgotten heritage of many generations. 5. The death and resurrection of Jerusalem. The birth of the Bible, the destruction of Jerusalem, the Babylonian captivity, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the second Isaiah, the liberation of the Jews, the second temple. Their greatest contemporary influence was on the writing of the Bible. As the people fell away from the worship of Yahweh to the adoration of alien gods, the priests began to wonder whether the time had not come to make a final stand against the disintegration of the national faith. Taking a leaf from the prophets, who attributed to Yahweh the passionate convictions of their own souls, they resolved to issue to the people a communication from God himself, a code of laws that would reinvigorate the moral life of the nation and would at the same time attract the support of the prophets by embodying the less extreme of their ideas. They readily won King Josiah to their plan, and about the 18th year of his reign the priest Hilkiah announced to the king that he had found in the secret archives of the temple an astonishing scroll in which the great Moses himself, at the direct dictation of Yahweh, had settled once and for all those problems of history and conduct that were being so hotly debated by prophets and priests. The discovery made a great stir. Josiah called the elders of Judah to the temple, and there read to them the Book of the Covenant, in the presence, we are told, of thousands of people. Then he solemnly swore that he would henceforth abide by the laws of this book, and he caused all that were present to stand to it. We do not know just what this Book of the Covenant was. It may have been Exodus, chapters 20 to 23, or it may have been Deuteronomy. We need not suppose that it had been invented on the spur of the situation. It merely formulated and put into writing decrees, demands, and exhortations which for centuries had emanated from the prophets in the temple. In any event, those who heard the reading, and even those who only heard of it, were deeply impressed. Josiah took advantage of this mood to raid the altars of Yahweh's rivals in Judah. He cast out of the temple of the Lord all the vessels that were made for Baal. He put down the idolatrous priests, and them also that burned incense unto Baal, to the sun, and to the moon, and to the planets. He defiled Tophet, that no man might make his son or his daughter to pass through the fire to Moloch. And he smashed the altars that Solomon had built for Chemosh, Milcom, and Astarte. These reforms did not seem to propitiate Yahweh or bring him to the aid of his people. Nineveh fell as the prophets had foretold, but only to leave little Judah subject first to Egypt and then to Babylon. When Pharaoh Necho, bound for Syria, tried to pass through Palestine, Josiah, relying upon Yahweh, resisted him on the ancient battle site of Megiddo, only to be defeated and slain. A few years later, Nebuchadrezzar overwhelmed Necho at Carchemish and made Judah a Babylonian dependency. Josiah's successors sought by secret diplomacy to liberate themselves from the clutch of Babylon and thought to bring Egypt to their rescue, but the fiery Nebuchadrezzar, getting wind of it, poured his soldiery into Palestine, captured Jerusalem, took King Jehoiakim prisoner, put Zedekiah on the throne of Judah, and carried 10,000 Jews into bondage. But Zedekiah too loved liberty or power, and rebelled against Babylon. Thereupon Nebuchadrezzar returned, and, resolving to settle the Jewish problem once and for all, as he thought, recaptured Jerusalem, burned it to the ground, destroyed the Temple of Solomon, slew Zedekiah's sons before his face, gouged out his eyes, and carried practically all the population of the city into captivity in Babylonia. Later, a Jewish poet sang one of the world's great songs about that unhappy caravan. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there they that carried us away captive required of us a song. And they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. If I prefer not Jerusalem above my chief joy. In all this crisis, the bitterest and most eloquent of the prophets defended Babylon as a scourge in the hands of God, denounced the rulers of Judah as obstinate fools, and advised such complete surrender to Nebuchadrezzar that the modern reader is tempted to wonder, could Jeremiah have been a paid agent of Babylonia? I have made the earth, the man, and the beast that are upon the ground, says Jeremiah's God, and now have I given all those lands under the hand of Nebuchadrezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and all nations shall serve him. And it shall come to pass that the nation and kingdom which will not serve the same Nebuchadrezzar, the king of Babylon, and that will not put their neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon, that nation will I punish, saith the Lord, with the sword, and with the famine, and with the pestilence, until I have consumed them by his hand. He may have been a traitor, but the book of his prophecies, supposedly taken down by his disciple Baruch, is not only one of the most passionately eloquent writings in all literature, as rich in vivid imagery as in merciless abuse, but it is marked with a sincerity that begins as a diffident self-questioning, and ends with honest doubts about his own course and all human life. Woe is me, my mother, that thou hast borne me, a man of strife, and a man of contention to the whole earth. I have neither lent on usury, nor men have lent to me on usury, yet every one of them doth curse me. Cursed be the day wherein I was born. A flame of indignation burned in him at the sight of moral depravity and political folly in his people and its leaders. He felt inwardly compelled to stand in the gate and call Israel to repentance. All this national decay, all this weakening of the state, this obviously imminent subjection of Judah to Babylon, were, it seemed to Jeremiah, Yahweh's hand laid upon the Jews in punishment for their sins. Run ye to and fro through the streets of Jerusalem, and see now, and know, and seek in the broad places thereof, if ye can find a man, if there be any that executeth judgment, that seeketh the truth, and I will pardon it. Everywhere iniquity ruled, and sex ran riot. Men were as fed horses in the morning, every one neighed after his neighbor's wife. When the Babylonians besieged Jerusalem, the rich men of the city, to propitiate Yahweh, released their Hebrew slaves. But when for a time the siege was raised and the danger seemed past, the rich apprehended their former slaves and forced them into their old bondage. It was a summary of human history that Jeremiah could not bear silently. Like the other prophets, he denounced those hypocrites who, with pious faces, brought to the temple some part of the gains they had made from grinding the faces of the poor. The Lord, he reminded them, in the eternal lesson of all finer religion, ask not for sacrifice, but for justice. The priests and the prophets, he thinks, are almost as false and corrupt as the merchants. They, too, like the people, need to be morally reborn, to be, in Jeremiah's strange phrase, circumcised in the spirit as well as in the flesh. Circumcise yourselves to the Lord, and take away the foreskins of your heart. Against these abuses the prophet preached with a fury rivaled only by the stern saints of Geneva, Scotland, and England. Jeremiah cursed the Jews savagely, and took some delight in picturing the ruin of all who would not heed him. Time and again he predicted the destruction of Jerusalem and the captivity in Babylon, and wept over the doomed city, whom he called the daughter of Zion, in terms anticipatory of Christ. Oh, that my head were waters, and mine eyes a fountain of tears, that I might weep day and night for the slain of the daughter of my people. To the princes of Zedekiah's court all this seemed sheer treason. It was dividing the Jews in counsel and spirit in the very hour of war. Jeremiah tantalized them by carrying a wooden yoke around his neck, explaining that all Judah must submit, the more peaceably the better, to the yoke of Babylon. And when Hananiah tore this yoke away, Jeremiah cried out that Yahweh would make yokes of iron for all the Jews. The priests tried to stop him by putting his head into the stocks, but from even that position he continued to denounce them. They arraigned him in the temple and wished to kill him, but through some friend among the priests he escaped. Then the princes arrested him and lowered him by ropes into a dungeon filled with mire. But Zedekiah had him raised to milder imprisonment in the palace court. There the Babylonians found him when Jerusalem fell. On Nebuchadrezzar's orders they treated him well and exempted him from the general exile. In his old age, says Orthodox tradition, he wrote his Lamentations, the most eloquent of all the books of the Old Testament. He mourned now the completeness of his triumph and the desolation of Jerusalem, and raised to heaven the unanswerable questions of Job. How doth the city sit solitary that was full of people? How she is become as a widow, she that was great among the nations, and princess among the provinces. How is she become tributary? Is it nothing to you, all ye that pass by? Behold, and see if there be any sorrow like unto my sorrow. Righteous art thou, O Lord, when I plead with thee. Yet let us talk with thee of thy judgments. Wherefore doth the way of the wicked prosper? Wherefore are all they happy that deal very treacherously? Meanwhile, in Babylon, another preacher was taking up the burden of prophecy. Ezekiel belonged to a priestly family that had been driven to Babylon in the first deportation from Jerusalem. He began his preaching, like the first Isaiah and Jeremiah, with fierce denunciations of idolatry and corruption in Jerusalem. At great length he compared Jerusalem to a harlot because she sold the favors of her worship to strange gods. He described Samaria and Jerusalem as twin whores. This word was as popular with him as with the dramatists of the Stuart Restoration. He made long lists of the sins of Jerusalem, and then condemned her to capture and destruction. Like Isaiah, he doomed the nations impartially, and announced the sins and fall of Moab, Tyre, Egypt, Assyria, even of the mysterious kingdom of Magog. But he was not as bitter as Jeremiah. In the end he relented, declared that the Lord would save a remnant of the Jews, and foretold the resurrection of their city. He described in vision the new temple that would be built there, and outlined a utopia in which the priests would be supreme, and in which Yahweh would dwell among his people forever. He hoped with this happy ending to keep up the spirits of the exiles and to retard their assimilation into the Babylonian culture and blood. Then as now it seemed that this process of absorption would destroy the unity, even the identity of the Jews. They flourished on Mesopotamia's rich soil, they enjoyed considerable freedom of custom and worship, they grew rapidly in numbers and wealth, and prospered in the unwonted tranquility and harmony which their subjection had brought to them. An ever-rising proportion of them accepted the gods of Babylon and the Epicurean ways of the old metropolis. When the second generation of exiles grew up, Jerusalem was almost forgotten. It was the function of the unknown author who undertook to complete the book of Isaiah to restate the religion of Israel for this backsliding generation, and it was his distinction in restating it to lift it to the loftiest plane that any religion had yet reached amid all the faiths of the Near East. We know nothing of the history of this writer who, by a literary device and license common to his time, chose to speak in the name of Isaiah. We merely guess that he wrote shortly before or after Cyrus liberated the Jews. Biblical scholarship assigns to him chapters 40 through 55, and to another and later unknown or unknowns, chapters 56 through 66. While Buddha in India was preaching the death of desire, and Confucius in China was formulating wisdom for his people, this second Isaiah, in majestic and luminous prose, announced to the exiled Jews the first clear revelation of monotheism, and offered them a new God, infinitely richer in loving kindness and tender mercy than the bitter Yahweh even of the first Isaiah. In words that a later gospel was to choose as spurring on the young Christ, this greatest of prophets announced his mission, no longer to curse the people for their sins, but to bring them hope in their bondage. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord hath anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. He hath sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to them that are bound. For he has discovered that Yahweh is not a God of war and vengeance, but a loving Father. The discovery fills him with happiness and inspires him to magnificent songs. He predicts the coming of the new God to rescue his people. The voice of him that crieth in the wilderness, Prepare ye the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the crooked shall be made straight, and the rough places plain. Behold, the Lord God will come with strong hand, and his arm shall rule for him. He shall feed his flock like a shepherd. He shall gather the lambs with his arm, and carry them in his bosom, and shall gently lead those that are with young. The prophet then lifts the messianic hope to a place among the ruling ideas of his people, and describes the servant who will redeem Israel by vicarious sacrifice. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. The Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all." Modern research does not regard this servant as the prophetic portrayal of Jesus. Persia, the second Isaiah predicts, will be the instrument of this liberation. Cyrus is invincible. He will take Babylon and will free the Jews from their captivity. They will return to Jerusalem and build a new temple, a new city, a very paradise. The wolf and the lamb shall feed together, and the lion shall eat straw like a bullock, and dust shall be the serpent's meat. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, saith the Lord. Perhaps it was the rise of Persia and the spread of its power, subjecting all the states of the Near East in an imperial unity vaster and better governed than any social organization men had yet known, that suggested to the prophet the conception of one universal deity. No longer does his God say, like the Yahweh of Moses, "I am the Lord thy God. Thou shalt not have strange gods before me." Now it is written, "I am the Lord, and there is none else. There is no God besides me." The prophet-poet describes this universal deity in one of the great passages of the Bible. "Who hath measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, and meted out heaven with the span, and comprehended the dust of the earth in a measure, and weighed the mountains in scales, and the hills in a balance? Behold, the nations are as a drop of a bucket, and are counted as the small dust of the balance. Behold, he taketh up the isles as a very little thing. All nations before him are as nothing, and they are counted to him less than nothing, and vanity. To whom then will ye liken God, or what likeness will ye compare with him? It is he that sitteth upon the circle of the earth, and the inhabitants thereof are as grasshoppers, that stretcheth out the heavens as a curtain, and spreadeth them out as a tent to dwell in. Lift up your eyes on high, and behold who hath created these things." It was a dramatic hour in the history of Israel, when at last Cyrus entered Babylon as a world conqueror, and gave to the exiled Jews full freedom to return to Jerusalem. He disappointed some of the prophets and showed his superior civilization by leaving Babylon and its population unhurt and offering a skeptical obeisance to its gods. He restored to the Jews what remained in the Babylonian treasury of the gold and silver taken by Nebuchadrezzar from the temple, and instructed the communities in which the exiles lived to furnish them with funds for their long journey home. The younger Jews were not enthusiastic at this liberation. Many of them had sunk strong roots into Babylonian soil, and hesitated to abandon their fertile fields and their flourishing trade for the desolate ruins of the holy city. It was not until 2 years after Cyrus's coming that the first detachment of zealots set out on the long 3-month journey back to the land which their fathers had left half a century before. They found themselves, then as now, not entirely welcome in their ancient home, for meanwhile other Semites had settled there, and had made the soil their own by occupation and toil. And these tribes looked with hatred upon the apparent invaders of what seemed to them their native fields. The returning Jews could not possibly have established themselves had it not been for the strong and friendly empire that protected them. The prince Zerubbabel won permission from the Persian king Darius I to rebuild the temple. And though the immigrants were small in number and resources, and the work was hindered at every step by the attacks and conspiracies of a hostile population, it was carried to completion within some 22 years after the return. Slowly Jerusalem became again a Jewish city, and the temple resounded with the psalms of a rescued remnant resolved to make Judea strong again. It was a great triumph, surpassed only by that which we have seen in our own historic time. 6. The people of the book. The book of the law, the composition of the Pentateuch, the myths of Genesis, the Mosaic Code, the 10 Commandments, the idea of God, the Sabbath, the Jewish family, estimate of the Mosaic legislation. To build a military state was impossible. Judea had neither the numbers nor the wealth for such an enterprise. Since some system of order was needed that, while recognizing the sovereignty of Persia, would give the Jews a natural discipline and a national unity, the clergy undertook to provide a theocratic rule based, like Josiah's, on priestly traditions and laws promulgated as divine commands. About the year 444 B.C., Ezra, a learned priest, called the Jews together in solemn assembly, and read to them from morn to midday the book of the law of Moses. For 7 days he and his fellow Levites read from these scrolls. At the end, the priests and the leaders of the people pledged themselves to accept this body of legislation as their constitution and their conscience, and to obey it forever. From those troubled times till ours, that law has been the central fact in the life of the Jews, and their loyalty to it through all wanderings and tribulations has been one of the impressive phenomena of history. What was this book of the law of Moses? Not quite the same as that book of the covenant which Josiah had read, for the latter had admitted of being completely read twice in a day, while the other needed a week. We can only guess that the larger scroll constituted a substantial part of those first 5 books of the Old Testament which the Jews call Torah, or the Law, and which others call the Pentateuch. Torah is Hebrew for direction, guidance. Pentateuch is Greek for 5 rolls. How, when, and where had these books been written? This is an innocent question which has caused the writing of 50,000 volumes and must here be left unanswered in a paragraph. The consensus of scholarship is that the oldest elements in the Bible are those distinct and yet similar legends of Genesis, which are called J and E, respectively, because one speaks of the Creator as Jehovah, Yahweh, while the other speaks of him as Elohim. It is believed that the Yahvist narrative was written in Judah, the Elohist in Ephraim, and that the 2 stories fused into one after the fall of Samaria. A third element, known as D and embodying the Deuteronomic Code, is probably by a distinct author or group of authors. A fourth element, P, is composed of sections later inserted by the priests. This priestly code is probably the substance of the Book of the Law promulgated by Ezra. The 4 compositions appear to have taken their present form about 300 B.C. These delightful tales of the creation, the temptation, and the flood were drawn from a storehouse of Mesopotamian legend as old as 3000 B.C. We have seen some early forms of them in the course of this history. It is possible that the Jews appropriated some of these myths from Babylonian literature during the captivity. It is more likely that they had adopted them long before, from ancient Semitic and Sumerian sources common to all the Near East. The Persian and the Talmudic forms of the creation myth represent God as first making a 2-sexed being, a male and a female joined at the back like Siamese twins, and then dividing it as an afterthought. We are reminded of a strange sentence in Genesis. Chapter 5, verse 2. Male and female created he them, and blessed them, and called their name Adam. That is, our first parent was originally both male and female, which seems to have escaped all theologians except Aristophanes. The legend of paradise appears in almost all folklore, in Egypt, India, Tibet, Babylonia, Persia, Greece, Polynesia, Mexico, etc. Most of these Edens had forbidden trees and were supplied with serpents or dragons that stole immortality from men or otherwise poisoned paradise. Both the serpent and the fig were probably phallic symbols. Behind the myth is the thought that sex and knowledge destroy innocence and happiness, and are the origin of evil. We shall find this same idea at the end of the Old Testament in Ecclesiastes as here at the beginning. In most of these stories, woman was the lovely, evil agent of the serpent or the devil, whether as Eve or Pandora, or the Po Se of Chinese legend. All things, says the Shi Ching, at first were subject to man, but a woman threw us into slavery. Our misery came not from heaven, but from woman. She lost the human race. Ah, unhappy Po Se! Thou kindled the fire that consumes us, and which is every day increasing. The world is lost. Vice overflows all things. Even more universal was the story of the flood. Hardly an ancient people went without it, and hardly a mountain in Asia but had given perch to some water-wearied Noah or Shamash Napishtim. Usually these legends were the popular vehicle or allegory of a philosophical judgment or a moral attitude, summarizing long racial experience. That sex and knowledge bring more grief than joy, and that human life is periodically threatened by floods, that is, ruinous inundations of the great rivers whose waters made possible the earliest known civilizations. To ask whether these stories are true or false, whether they really happened, would be to put a trivial and superficial question. Their substance, of course, is not the tales they tell, but the judgments they convey. Meanwhile, it would be unwise not to enjoy their disarming simplicity and the vivid swiftness of their narratives. The books which Josiah and Ezra caused to be read to the people formulated that Mosaic code, on which all later Jewish life was to be built. Of this legislation, the cautious Sarton writes, "Its importance in the history of institutions and of law cannot be overestimated. It was the most thoroughgoing attempt in history to use religion as a basis of statesmanship, and as a regulator of every detail of life. The law became, says Renan, the tightest garment into which life was ever laced. Diet, medicine, personal, menstrual, and natal hygiene, public sanitation, sexual inversion and bestiality, all are made subjects of divine ordinance and guidance." Again, we observe how slowly the doctor was differentiated from the priest, to become in time his greatest enemy. Leviticus, chapters 13 through 15, legislates carefully for the treatment of venereal disease, even to the most definite directions for segregation, disinfection, fumigation, and, if necessary, the complete burning of the house in which the disease has run its course. The ancient Hebrews were the founders of prophylaxis, but they seem to have had no surgery beyond circumcision. This rite, common among ancient Egyptians and modern Semites, was not only a sacrifice to God and a compulsion to racial loyalty, it was a hygienic precaution against sexual uncleanliness. Perhaps it was this code of cleanliness that helped to preserve the Jews through their long odyssey of dispersion and suffering. For the rest, the code centered about those 10 commandments, Exodus, chapter 20, verses 1 through 17, which were destined to receive the lip service of half the world. The first laid the foundation of the new theocratic community, which was to rest not upon any civil law, but upon the idea of God. He was the invisible king who dictated every law and meted out every penalty, and his people were to be called Israel, as meaning the defenders of God. The Hebrew state was dead, but the temple remained. The priests of Judea, like the popes of Rome, would try to restore what the kings had failed to save. Hence the explicitness and reiteration of the first commandment. Heresy or blasphemy must be punished with death, even if the heretic should be one's closest kin. The priestly authors of the code, like the pious inquisitors, believed that religious unity was an indispensable condition of social organization and solidarity. It was this intolerance and their racial pride that embroiled and preserved the Jews. The second commandment elevated the national conception of God at the expense of art. No graven images were ever to be made of him. It assumed a high intellectual level among the Jews, for it rejected superstition and anthropomorphism, and, despite the all-too-human quality of the Pentateuch Yahweh, tried to conceive of God as beyond every form and image. It conscripted Hebrew devotion for religion, and left nothing in ancient days for science and art. Even astronomy was neglected, lest corrupt diviners should multiply, or the stars be worshipped as divinities. In Solomon's temple there had been an almost heathen abundance of imagery. In the new temple there was none. The old images had been carried off to Babylon and apparently had not been returned along with utensils of silver and gold. Hence we find no sculpture, painting, or bas-relief after the captivity, and very little before it, except under the almost alien Solomon. Architecture and music were the only arts that the priests would allow. Song and temple ritual redeemed the life of the people from gloom. An orchestra of several instruments joined as one to make one sound, with a great choir of voices, to sing the psalms that glorified the temple and its God. David and all the house of Israel played before the Lord on harps, psalteries, timbrels, cornets, and cymbals. The third commandment typified the intense piety of the Jew. Not only would he not take the name of the Lord God in vain, he would never pronounce it. Even when he came upon the name of Yahweh in his prayers, he would substitute for it Adonai, Lord. Only the Hindus would rival this piety. The fourth commandment sanctified the weekly day of rest as a Sabbath, and passed it down as one of the strongest institutions of mankind. The name, and perhaps the custom, came from Babylon. Shabbatu was applied by the Babylonians to taboo days of abstinence and propitiation. Besides this weekly holy day, there were great festivals, once Canaanite vegetation rites, reminiscent of sowing and harvesting, and the cycles of moon and sun. Matzot, called Pentecost, celebrated the end of the wheat harvest. Sukkot commemorated the vintage. Pesach, or Passover, was the feast of the first fruits of the flock. Rosh Hashanah announced the new year. Only later were these festivals adapted to commemorate vital events in the history of the Jews. On the first day of the Passover, a lamb or kid was sacrificed and eaten, and its blood was sprinkled upon the doors as the portion of the god. Later, the priests attached this custom to the story of Yahweh's slaughter of the firstborn of the Egyptians. The lamb was once a totem of a Canaanite clan. The Passover among the Canaanites was the oblation of a lamb to the local god. As we read in Exodus chapter 11 the story of the establishment of the Passover rite and see the Jews celebrating that same rite steadfastly today, we feel again the venerable antiquity of their worship and the strength and tenacity of their race. The fifth commandment sanctified the family as second only to the temple in the structure of Jewish society. The ideals then stamped upon the institution marked it throughout medieval and modern European history until our own disintegrative industrial revolution. The Hebrew patriarchal family was a vast economic and political organization composed of the oldest married male, his wives, his unmarried children, his married sons with their wives and children, and perhaps some slaves. The economic basis of the institution was its convenience for cultivating the soil. Its political value lay in its providing a system of social order so strong that it made the state, except in war, almost superfluous. The father's authority was practically unlimited. The land was his, and his children could survive only by obedience to him. He was the state. If he was poor, he could sell his daughter before her puberty as a bondservant, and though occasionally he condescended to ask her consent, he had full right to dispose of her in marriage as he wished. Boys were supposed to be products of the right testicle, girls of the left, which was believed to be smaller and weaker than the right. At first, marriage was matrilocal. The man had to leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife in her clan. But this custom gradually died out after the establishment of the monarchy. Yahweh's instructions to the wife were, "Thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee." Though technically subject, the woman was often a person of high authority and dignity. The history of the Jews shines with such names as Sarah, Rachel, Miriam, and Esther. Deborah was one of the judges of Israel, and it was the prophetess Huldah whom Josiah consulted about the book which the priests had found in the temple. The mother of many children was certain of security and honor. For the little nation longed to increase and multiply, feeling, as in Palestine today, its dangerous numerical inferiority to the peoples surrounding it. Therefore, the exalted motherhood branded celibacy as a sin and a crime, made marriage compulsory after 20, even in priests, abhorred marriageable virgins and childless women, and looked upon abortion, infanticide, and other means of limiting population as heathen abominations that stank in the nostrils of the Lord. And when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister, and said unto Jacob, "Give me children, or else I die." The perfect wife was one who labored constantly in and about her home, and had no thought except in her husband and her children. The last chapter of Proverbs states the male ideal of woman completely. Who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies. The heart of her husband doth safely trust in her, so that he shall have no need of spoil. She will do him good and not evil all the days of her life. She seeketh wool and flax, and worketh willingly with her hands. She is like the merchant's ships, she bringeth her food from afar. She riseth also while it is yet night, and giveth meat to her household, and a portion to her maidens. She considereth a field, and buyeth it. With the fruit of her hands she planteth a vineyard. She girdeth her loins with strength, and strengtheneth her arms. She perceiveth that her merchandise is good. Her candle goeth not out by night. She layeth her hands to the spindle, and her hands hold the distaff. She stretcheth out her hand to the poor. Yea, she reacheth forth her hands to the needy. She maketh herself coverings of tapestry. Her clothing is silk and purple. Her husband is known in the gates, when he sitteth among the elders of the land. She maketh fine linen, and selleth it, and delivereth girdles unto the merchant. Strength and honor are her clothing, and she shall rejoice in time to come. She openeth her mouth with wisdom, and in her tongue is the law of kindness. She looketh well to the ways of her household, and eateth not the bread of idleness. Her children arise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praiseth her. Give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates. The sixth commandment was a counsel of perfection. Nowhere is there so much killing as in the Old Testament. Its chapters oscillate between slaughter and compensatory reproduction. Tribal quarrels, internal factions, and hereditary vendettas broke the monotony of intermittent peace. Despite a magnificent verse about plowshares and pruning hooks, the prophets were not pacifists, and the priests, if we may judge from the speeches which they put into the mouth of Yahweh, were almost as fond of war as of preaching. Among 19 kings of Israel, 8 were assassinated. Captured cities were usually destroyed, the males put to the sword, and the soil deliberately ruined, in the fashion of the times. Perhaps the figures exaggerate the killing. It is unbelievable that, entirely without modern inventions, the children of Israel slew of the Syrians 100,000 footmen in one day. Belief in themselves as the chosen people intensified the pride natural in a nation conscious of superior abilities. It accentuated their disposition to segregate themselves maritally and mentally from other peoples, and deprived them of the international perspective that their descendants were to attain. But they had in high degree the virtues of their qualities. Their violence came of unmanageable vitality, their separatism came of their piety, their quarrelsomeness and querulousness came of a passionate sensitivity that produced the greatest literature of the Near East. Their racial pride was the indispensable prop of their courage through centuries of suffering. Men are what they have had to be. The seventh commandment recognized marriage as the basis of the family, as the fifth had recognized the family as the basis of society, and it offered to marriage all the support of religion. It said nothing about sex relations before marriage, but other regulations laid upon the bride the obligation under pain of death by stoning to prove her virginity on the day of her marriage. Nevertheless, prostitution was common, and pederasty apparently survived the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. As the law did not seem to prohibit relations with foreign harlots, Syrian, Moabite, Midianite, and other strange women flourished along the highways, where they lived in booths and tents, and combined the trades of peddler and prostitute. Solomon, who had no violent prejudices in these matters, relaxed the laws that had kept such women out of Jerusalem. In time they multiplied so rapidly there that in the days of the Maccabees the temple itself was described by an indignant reformer as full of fornication and harlotry. Love affairs probably occurred, for there was much tenderness between the sexes. Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed unto him but a few days for the love he had to her. But love played a very small role in the choice of mates. Before the exile, marriage was completely secular, arranged by the parents or by the suitor with the parents of the bride. Vestiges of capture marriage are found in the Old Testament. Yahweh approves of it in war, and the elders, on the occasion of a shortage of women, commanded the children of Benjamin, saying, Go and lie in wait in the vineyards, and see and behold if the daughters of Shiloh come out to dance in dances. Then come ye out of the vineyards, and catch you every man his wife of the daughters of Shiloh, and go to the land of Benjamin. But this was exceptional. Usually the marriage was by purchase. Jacob purchased Leah and Rachel by his toil. The gentle Ruth was quite simply bought by Boaz, and the prophet Hosea regretted exceedingly that he had given 50 shekels for his wife. The word for wife, Beulah, meant owned. The father of the bride reciprocated by giving his daughter a dowry, an institution admirably adapted to diminish the socially disruptive gap between the sexual and the economic maturity of children in an urban civilization. If the man was well-to-do, he might practice polygamy. If the wife was barren, like Sarah, she might encourage her husband to take a concubine. The purpose of these arrangements was prolific reproduction. It was taken as a matter of course that after Rachel and Leah had given Jacob all the children they were capable of bearing, they should offer him their maids, who would also bear him children. A woman was not allowed to remain idle in this matter of reproduction. If a husband died, his brother, however many wives he might already have, was obliged to marry her. Or if the husband had no brother, the obligation fell upon his nearest surviving male kin. Since private property was the core of Jewish economy, the double standard prevailed. The man might have many wives, but the woman was confined to one man. Adultery meant relations with the woman who had been bought and paid for by another man. It was a violation of the law of property, and was punished with death for both parties. Fornication was forbidden to women, but was looked upon as a venial offense in men. Divorce was free to the man, but extremely difficult for the woman until Talmudic days. The husband does not seem to have abused his privileges unduly. He is pictured to us, all in all, as zealously devoted to his wife and his children. And though love did not determine marriage, it often flowered out of it. Isaac took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her, and Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. Probably in no other people outside of the Far East has family life reached so high a level as among the Jews. The Eighth Commandment sanctified private property and bound it up with religion and the family as one of the three bases of Hebrew society. Property was almost entirely in land. Until the days of Solomon there was little industry beyond that of the potter and the smith. Even agriculture was not completely developed. The bulk of the population devoted itself to rearing sheep and cattle and tending the vine, the olive, and the fig. They lived in tents rather than houses in order to move more easily to fresh pastures. In time, their growing economic surplus generated trade, and the Jewish merchants, by their tenacity and their skill, began to flourish in Damascus, Tyre, and Sidon, and in the precincts of the temple itself. There was no coinage till near the time of the captivity, but gold and silver, weighed in each transaction, became a medium of exchange, and bankers appeared in great numbers to finance commerce and enterprise. It was nothing strange that these money-lenders should use the courts of the temple. It was a custom general in the Near East, and survives there in many places to this day. Yahweh beamed upon the growing power of the Hebrew financiers. "Thou shalt lend unto many nations," he said, "but thou shalt not borrow." A generous philosophy that has made great fortunes, though it has not seemed in our century to be divinely inspired. As in the other countries of the Near East, war captives and convicts were used as slaves, and hundreds of thousands of them toiled in cutting timber and transporting materials for such public works as Solomon's temple and palace. But the owner had no power of life and death over his slaves, and the slave might acquire property and buy his liberty. Men could be sold as bondservants for unpaid debts, or could sell their children in their place. And this continued to the days of Christ. These typical institutions of the Near East were mitigated in Judea by generous charity and a vigorous campaign by priest and prophet against exploitation. The code laid it down hopefully that ye shall not oppress one another. It asked that Hebrew bondservants should be released, and debts among Jews cancelled every 7th year. And when this was found too idealistic for the masters, the law proclaimed the institution of the Jubilee, by which every 50 years all slaves and debtors should be freed. And ye shall hallow the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land, unto all the inhabitants thereof. It shall be a jubilee unto you, and ye shall return every man unto his possession, and ye shall return every man unto his family. We have no evidence that this fine edict was obeyed, but we must give credit to the priests for leaving no lesson in charity untaught. If there be among you a poor man of one of thy brethren, thou shalt open thine hand wide unto him, and shalt surely lend him sufficient for his need. And take thou no usury, that is, interest, of him. The Sabbath rest was to be extended to every employee, even to animals. Stray sheaves and fruits were to be left in the fields and orchards for the poor to glean. And though these charities were largely for fellow Jews, the stranger in the gates was also to be treated with kindness. The sojourner was to be sheltered and fed, and dealt with honorably. At all times the Jews were bidden to remember that they, too, had once been homeless, even bondservants, in a foreign land. The 9th commandment, by demanding absolute honesty of witnesses, put the prop of religion under the whole structure of Jewish law. An oath was to be a religious ceremony. Not merely was a man in swearing to place his hand on the genitals of him to whom he swore, as in the old custom. He was now to be taking God himself as his witness and his judge. False witnesses, according to the code, were to receive the same punishment that their testimony had sought to bring upon their victims. Religious law was the sole law of Israel. The priests in the temples were the judges in the courts, and those who refused to accept the decision of the priests were to be put to death. Ordeal by the drinking of poisonous water was prescribed in certain cases of doubtful guilt. There was no other than religious machinery for enforcing the law. It had to be left to personal conscience and public opinion. Minor crimes might be atoned for by confession and compensation. Capital punishment was decreed by Yahweh's instructions for murder, kidnapping, idolatry, adultery, striking or cursing a parent, stealing a slave, or lying with a beast, but not for the killing of a servant. and thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Yahweh was quite satisfied to have the individual take the law into his own hands in case of murder. The revenger of blood himself shall slay the murderer. When he meeteth him, he shall slay him. Certain cities, however, were to be set apart to which a criminal might flee, and in which the avenger must stay his revenge. In general, the principle of punishment was the lex talionis. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, stripe for stripe. We trust that this was a counsel of perfection never quite realized. The Mosaic Code, though written down at least 1,500 years later, shows no advance in criminal legislation upon the Code of Hammurabi. In legal organization it shows an archaic retrogression to primitive ecclesiastical control. The 10th commandment reveals how clearly woman was conceived under the rubric of property. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, and thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's. Nevertheless, it was an admirable precept. Could men follow it, half the fever and anxiety of our life would be removed. Strange to say, the greatest of the commandments is not listed among the 10, though it is part of the law. It occurs in Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 18, lost amid a repetition of sundry laws, and reads very simply, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. In general, it was a lofty code, sharing its defects with its age, and rising to virtues characteristically its own. We must remember that it was only a law, indeed only a priestly utopia, rather than a description of Jewish life. Like other codes, it was honored plentifully in the breach and won new praise with every violation. But its influence upon the conduct of the people was at least as great as that of most legal or moral codes. It gave to the Jews, through the 2,000 years of wandering which they were soon to begin, a portable fatherland, as Heine was to call it, an intangible and spiritual state. It kept them united despite every dispersion, proud despite every defeat, and brought them across the centuries to our own time, a strong and apparently indestructible people. 7. The literature and philosophy of the Bible. History, fiction, poetry, the Psalms, the Song of Songs, Proverbs, Job, the idea of immortality, the pessimism of Ecclesiastes, the advent of Alexander. The Old Testament is not only law, it is history, poetry, and philosophy of the highest order. After making every deduction for primitive legend and pious fraud, after admitting that the historical books are not quite as accurate or as ancient as our forefathers supposed, we find in them nevertheless not merely some of the oldest historical writing known to us, but some of the best. The books of Judges, Samuel, and Kings may, as some scholars believe, have been put together hastily during or shortly after the exile to collect and preserve the national traditions of a scattered and broken people. Nevertheless, the stories of Saul, David, and Solomon are immeasurably finer in structure and style than the other historical writing of the ancient Near East. Even Genesis, if we read it with some understanding of the function of legend, is, barring its genealogies, an admirable story, told without frill or ornament, with simplicity, vividness, and force. And in a sense we have here not mere history, but philosophy of history. This is the first recorded effort of man to reduce the multiplicity of past events to a measure of unity by seeking in them some pervading purpose and significance, some law of sequence and causation, some illumination for the present and the future. The conception of history promulgated by the prophets and the priestly authors of the Pentateuch survived 1,000 years of Greece and Rome to become the world view of European thinkers, from Boethius to Bossuet. Midway between the history and the poetry are the fascinating romances of the Bible. There is nothing more perfect in the realm of prose than the story of Ruth. Only less excellent are the tales of Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin, Samson and Delilah, Esther, Judith and Daniel. The poetical literature begins with the Song of Moses, Exodus chapter 15, and the Song of Deborah, Judges chapter 5, and reaches finally to the heights of the Psalms. The penitential hymns of the Babylonians had prepared for these, and perhaps had given them material as well as form. Ichnaton's Ode to the Sun seems to have contributed to Psalm 104, and the majority of the Psalms, instead of being the impressively united work of David, are probably the compositions of several poets writing long after the captivity, probably in the 3rd century before Christ. But all this is as irrelevant as the name or sources of Shakespeare. What matters is that the Psalms are at the head of the world's lyric poetry. They were not meant to be read at a sitting or in a higher critic's mood. They are at their best as expressing moments of pious ecstasy and stimulating faith. They are marred for us by bitter imprecations, tiresome groanings and complaints, and endless adulation of a Yahweh who, with all his loving kindness and long-suffering and compassion, pours smoke out of his nostrils and fire out of his mouth, number 8, promises that the wicked shall be turned into hell, in number 9, laps up flattery and threatens to cut off all flattering lips, number 12. The Psalms are full of military ardor, hardly Christian, but very pilgrim. Some of them, however, are jewels of tenderness or cameos of humility. Verily every man at his best state is altogether vanity. As for man, his days are as grass, as a flower of the field, so he flourisheth. For the wind passeth over it, and it is gone, and the place thereof shall know it no more. Number 29 and number 103. In these songs we feel the antistrophic rhythm of ancient Oriental poetry, and almost hear the voices of majestic choirs in alternate answering. No poetry has ever excelled this in revealing metaphor or living imagery. Never has religious feeling been more intensely or vividly expressed. These poems touch us more deeply than any lyric of love. They move even the skeptical soul, for they give passionate form to the final longing of the developed mind, for some perfection to which it may dedicate its striving. Here and there, in the King James Version, are pithy phrases that have become almost words in our language. Out of the mouths of babes, number 8. The apple of the eye, number 17. Put not your trust in princes, number 146. And everywhere in the original are similes that have never been surpassed. The rising sun is as a bridegroom coming out of his chamber, and rejoiceth as a strong man to run a race, number 19. We can only imagine what majesty and beauty must clothe these songs in the sonorous language of their origin. When, beside these psalms, we place in contrast the Song of Solomon, we get a glimpse of that sensual and terrestrial element in Jewish life which the Old Testament, written almost entirely by prophets and priests, has perhaps concealed from us, just as Ecclesiastes reveals a skepticism not otherwise discernible in the carefully selected and edited literature of the ancient Jews. This strangely amorous composition is an open field for surmise. It may be a collection of songs of Babylonian origin, celebrating the love of Ishtar and Tammuz. It may be, since it contains words borrowed from the Greek, the work of several Hebrew anacreons touched by the Hellenistic spirit that entered Judea with Alexander. Or, since the lovers address each other as brother and sister in the Egyptian manner, it may be a flower of Alexandrian Jewry, plucked by some quite emancipated soul from the banks of the Nile. In any case, its presence in the Bible is a charming mystery. By what winking or hoodwinking of the theologians did these songs of lusty passion find room between Isaiah and the preacher? A bundle of myrrh is my well-beloved unto me. He shall lie all night betwixt my breasts. My beloved is unto me as a cluster of camphor in the vineyards of Engedi. Behold, thou art fair, my love. Behold, thou art fair, thou hast dove's eyes. Behold, thou art fair, my beloved, yea, pleasant. Also our bed is green. I am the rose of Sharon and the lily of the valleys. Stay me with flagons, comfort me with apples, for I am sick of love. I charge you, O ye daughters of Jerusalem, by the roes or by the hinds of the field, that ye stir not up nor awake my love till he please. My beloved is mine, and I am his. He feedeth among the lilies. Until the day break and the shadows flee away, turn, my beloved, and be thou like a roe or a young hart upon the mountains of Bether. Come, my beloved, let us go forth into the field. Let us lodge in the villages. Let us get up early to the vineyards. Let us see if the vine flourish, whether the tender grape appear, and the pomegranates bud forth. There will I give thee my loves. This is the voice of youth, and that of the Proverbs is the voice of old age. Men look to love and life for everything. They receive a little less than that. They imagine that they have received nothing. These are the 3 stages of the pessimist. So this legendary Solomon warns youth against the evil woman, for she hath cast down many wounded. Yea, many strong men have been slain by her. Whoso committeth adultery with a woman lacketh understanding. There be 3 things which are wonderful to me, yea, 4 which I know not. The way of an eagle in the air, the way of a serpent upon a rock, the way of a ship in the midst of the sea, and the way of a man with a maid. He agrees with St. Paul that it is better to marry than to burn. Rejoice with the wife of thy youth. Let her be as the loving hind and the pleasant roe. Let her breasts satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished always with her love. Better is a dinner of herbs where love is than a stalled ox with hatred therewith. Can these be the words of the husband of 700 wives? Next to unchastity in the way of wisdom is sloth. Go to the ant, thou sluggard. How long wilt thou sleep, O sluggard? Seest thou a man diligent in his business? He shall stand before kings. Yet will the philosopher not brook crass ambition. He that maketh haste to be rich shall not be innocent, and the prosperity of fools shall destroy them. Work is wisdom, words are mere folly. In all labor there is profit, but the talk of the lips tendeth only to penury. A fool uttereth all his mind, but a wise man keepeth it in till afterwards. Even a fool, when he holdeth his peace, is counted wise. The lesson which the sage never tires of repeating is an almost Socratic identification of virtue and wisdom, redolent of those schools of Alexandria in which Hebrew theology was mating with Greek philosophy to form the intellect of Europe. Understanding is a wellspring of life unto him that hath it, but the instruction of fools is folly. Happy is the man that findeth wisdom, and the man that getteth understanding. For the merchandise of it is better than the merchandise of silver, and the gain thereof than fine gold. She is more precious than rubies, and all things thou canst desire are not to be compared with her. Length of days is in her right hand, and in her left hand riches and honor. Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. Job is earlier than Proverbs. Perhaps it was written during the exile, and described by allegory the captives of Babylon. I call it, says the perfervid Carlyle, one of the grandest things ever written with a pen. A noble book, all men's book. It is our first oldest statement of the never-ending problem, man's destiny and God's ways with him here on this earth. There is nothing written, I think, in the Bible or out of it, of equal literary merit. The problem arose out of the Hebrew emphasis on this world. Since there was no heaven in ancient Jewish theology, virtue had to be rewarded here or never. But often it seemed that only the wicked prospered, and that the choicest sufferings are reserved for the good man. Why, as the psalmist complained, did the ungodly prosper in the world? Why did God hide himself instead of punishing the evil and rewarding the good? The author of Job now asked the same questions more resolutely, and offered his hero perhaps as a symbol for his people. All Israel had worshipped Yahweh fitfully, as Job had done. Babylon had ignored and blasphemed Yahweh, and yet Babylon flourished, and Israel ate the dust and wore the sackcloth of desolation and captivity. What could one say of such a God? In a prologue in heaven, which some clever scribe may have inserted to take the scandal out of the book, Satan suggests to Yahweh that Job is perfect and upright only because he is fortunate. Would he retain his piety in adversity? Yahweh permits Satan to heap a variety of calamities upon Job's head. For a time the hero is as patient as Job, but at last his fortitude breaks. He ponders suicide and bitterly reproaches his God for forsaking him. Zophar, who has come out to enjoy the sufferings of his friend, insists that God is just, and will yet reward the good man even on earth, but Job shuts him up sharply. No doubt but ye are the people, and wisdom shall die with you, but I have understanding as well as you. Yea, who knoweth not these things? The tabernacles of robbers prosper, and they that provoke God are secure, into whose hand God bringeth abundantly. Lo, mine eye hath seen all this, mine ear hath heard and understood it. But ye are forgers of lies, ye are all physicians of no value. Oh, that ye would altogether hold your peace, and it should be your wisdom. He reflects on the brevity of life, and the length of death. Man that is born of woman is of few days, and full of trouble. He cometh forth like a flower, and is cut down. He fleeth also as a shadow, and continueth not. For there is hope of a tree, if it be cut down, that it will sprout again, and that the tender branch thereof will not cease. But man dieth and wasteth away. Yea, man giveth up the ghost, and where is he? As the waters fall from the sea, and the flood decayeth and drieth up, so man lieth down and riseth not. If a man die, shall he live again? The debate continues vigorously, and Job becomes more and more skeptical of his God, until he calls him adversary, and wishes that this adversary would destroy himself by writing a book, perhaps some Leibnizian theodicy. The concluding words of this chapter, "The words of Job are ended," suggest that this was the original termination of a discourse which, like that of Ecclesiastes, represented a strong heretical minority among the Jews. But a fresh philosopher enters at this point, Elihu, who demonstrates in 165 verses the justice of God's ways with men. Finally, in one of the most majestic passages in the Bible, a voice comes down out of the clouds. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind, and said, Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. Who hath laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest? Or who hath stretched his line upon it? Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened? Or who laid the cornerstone thereof? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who shut up the sea with doors when it brake forth, as if it had issued out of the womb? When I made the cloud the garment thereof, and thick darkness a swaddling band for it, and brake up for it my decreed place, and set bars and doors, and said, Hitherto shalt thou come, but no further, and here shall thy proud waves be stayed. Hast thou commanded the morning since thy days, and caused the dayspring to know his place? Hast thou entered into the springs of the sea, or hast thou walked in the search of the depth? Have the gates of death been opened unto thee, or hast thou seen the doors of the shadow of death? Hast thou perceived the breath of the earth? Declare if thou knowest it all. Hast thou entered into the treasures of the snow, or hast thou seen the treasures of the hail? Canst thou bind the sweet influences of the Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? Knowest thou the ordinances of heaven? Canst thou set the dominion thereof in the earth? Who hath put wisdom in the inward parts, or who hath given understanding to the heart? Shall he that contendeth with the Almighty instruct him? He that reproveth God, let him answer it. Job humbles himself in terror before this apparition. Yahweh, appeased, forgives him, accepts his sacrifice, denounces Job's friends for their feeble arguments, and gives Job 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, 1,000 she-asses, 7 sons, 3 daughters, and 140 years. It is a lame but happy ending. Job receives everything but an answer to his questions. The problem remained, and it was to have profound effects upon later Jewish thought. In the days of Daniel, circa 167 B.C., it was to be abandoned as insoluble in terms of this world. No answer could be given. Daniel and Enoch, and Kant, would say, unless one believed in some other life beyond the grave in which all wrongs would be righted, the wicked would be punished and the just would inherit infinite reward. This was one of the varied currents of thought that flowed into Christianity and carried it to victory. In Ecclesiastes, the problem is given a pessimistic reply. Prosperity and misfortune have nothing to do with virtue and vice. All things have I seen in the days of my vanity. There is a just man that perisheth in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man that prolongeth his life in his wickedness. So I returned and considered all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and beheld the tears of such as were oppressed, and they had no comforter, and on the side of their oppressors there was power. If thou seest the oppression of the poor, and violent perverting of judgment and justice in a province, marvel not at the matter, for there be higher than they. It is not virtue and vice that determine a man's lot, but blind and merciless chance. I saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, neither yet bread to the wise, nor yet riches to men of understanding, nor yet favor to men of skill, but time and chance happeneth to them all. Even wealth is insecure, and does not long bring happiness. He that loveth silver shall not be satisfied with silver, nor he that loveth abundance with increase. This is also vanity. The sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eat little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not suffer him to sleep. Remembering his relatives, he formulates Malthus in a line. When goods are increased, they are increased that eat them. Nor can he be soothed by any legend of a golden past or a utopia to come. Things have always been as they are now, and so they will always be. Say not thou what is the cause that the former days were better than these, for thou dost not inquire wisely concerning this. One must choose his historians carefully. And the thing that hath been, it is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything whereof it may be said, See, this is new? It hath been already of old time, which was before us. Progress, he thinks, is a delusion. Civilizations have been forgotten and will be again. In general, he feels that life is a sorry business, and might well be dispensed with. It is aimless and circuitous motion without permanent result, and ends where it began. It is a futile struggle in which nothing is certain except defeat. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What profit hath a man of all his labor which he taketh under the sun? One generation passeth away, and another generation cometh, but the earth abideth forever. The sun also ariseth, and the wind goeth toward the south, and turneth about unto the north. It whirleth about continually, and the wind returneth again according to his circuits. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. Unto the place from whence the rivers came, thither they return again. Wherefore I praise the dead which are already dead more than the living which are yet alive. Yea, better is he than both they, which hath not yet been, who hath not seen the evil work that is done under the sun. A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. For a time he seeks the answer to the riddle of life in abandonment to pleasure. Then I commended mirth, because a man hath no better thing under the sun than to eat and to drink and to be merry. But, behold, this also is vanity. The difficulty with pleasure is woman, from whom the preacher seems to have received some unforgettable sting. One man among 1,000 have I found, but a woman among all those have I not found. I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, and her hands as bands. Whoso pleaseth God shall escape her. He concludes his digression into this most obscure realm of philosophy by reverting to the advice of Solomon and Voltaire, who did not practice it. Live joyfully with the wife whom thou lovest all the days of the life of thy vanity which God hath given thee under the sun. Even wisdom is a questionable thing. He lauds it generously, but he suspects that anything more than a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Of making many books, he writes with uncanny foresight, there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. It might be wise to seek wisdom if God had given it a better income. Wisdom is good with an inheritance. Otherwise it is a snare and is apt to destroy its lovers. Truth is like Yahweh, who said to Moses, Thou canst not see my face, for there shall no man see me and live. In the end the wise man dies as thoroughly as the fool, and both come to the same odor. And I gave my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done under heaven. This sore travail hath God given to the sons of man to be exercised therewith. I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a chasing after the wind. I communed with mine own heart, saying, Lo, I am come to great estate, and have gotten more wisdom than all they that have been before me in Jerusalem. Yea, my heart had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I gave my heart to know wisdom, and to know madness and folly. I perceived that this also is a chasing after the wind. For in much wisdom is much grief, and he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow. All these darts of outrageous fortune might be borne with hope and courage if the just man could look forward to some happiness beyond the grave. But that too, Ecclesiastes feels, is a myth. Man is an animal, and dies like any other beast. For that which befalleth the sons of men befalleth beasts. Even one thing befalleth them. As the one dieth, so dieth the other. Yea, they have all one breath, so that a man hath no preeminence over a beast, for all is vanity. All go unto one place, all are of the dust, and all turn to dust again. Wherefore I perceive that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his portion. For who shall bring him to see what shall be after him? Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might, for there is no work, nor device, nor knowledge, nor wisdom in the grave, whither thou goest. What a commentary on the wisdom so lauded in the Proverbs! Here evidently civilization had for a time gone to seed. The vitality of Israel's youth had been exhausted by her struggles against the empires that surrounded her. The Yahweh in whom she had trusted had not come to her aid, and in her desolation and dispersion she raised to the skies this bitterest of all voices in literature to express the profoundest doubts that ever come to the human soul. Jerusalem had been restored, but not as the citadel of an unconquerable god. It was a vassal city ruled now by Persia, now by Greece. In 334 B.C., the young Alexander stood at its gates and demanded the surrender of the capital. The high priest at first refused, but the next morning, having had a dream, he consented. He ordered the clergy to put on their most impressive vestments, and the people to garb themselves in immaculate white. Then he led the population pacifically out through the gates to solicit peace. Alexander bowed to the high priest, expressed his admiration for the people and their God, and accepted Jerusalem. It was not the end of Judea. Only the first act had been played in this strange drama that binds 40 centuries. Christ would be the second, Ahasuerus the third. Today another act is played, but it is not the last. Destroyed and rebuilt, Jerusalem rises again, symbol of the vitality and pertinacity of an heroic race. The Jews, who are as old as history, may be as lasting as civilization.